Alan um, advertised this Raspberry Jan. He advertised it with a theme of 2004. So I thought I'd actually talk about 2004 and what was going on the internet back then. So when the internet at 2003 was relatively slow, it was modems. So we were getting like 56K as our connection speeds. But 2004, we started getting broadband as a popular thing. And we started getting broadband being popular and being cheap enough that people could actually have it. So we were having broadband for £18 a month when broadband meant it was 512 kilobits per second, which was fairly good at the time. We did get things like kind of articles like this saying that broadband has soared. We've actually got a much better connection speed in 2004 than we have previously. And we had the key statistics back then was that like 60% of people or 60% of homes had PCs. 50% of homes had internet access. There was 3.2 million broadband connections. So there was basically an explosion, or the start of the explosion, of the amount of broadband, the amount of home computers that were being used. To put the broadband in perspective, what I've got there is 3 lines. So the first line represents kind of the 90s and the early 2000s, and the internet connection speeds we had back then, 57 kilobits per second. Then proportionally, the 2004 connection speeds at about half a megabit per second, so the 512 kilobits per second. And then comparing it to what I managed to find out was the broadband speeds, or the average broadband speeds for now, which is 29 megabits per second. Of course, lots of people have much better broadband than that. Lots of people have much worse broadband than that. I'm assuming Alan has much worse broadband than that at the moment, especially sat in a car. Yeah, that is quite worrying, Alan. So those speeds, so the 2004 speeds, there was stuff going on kind of at the time. People were downloading MP3s, people were trying to download software. So what I've got there is a graph that shows in minutes how long it takes to download an average MP3 from a 56K modem, a 57K modem, be in the 90s, in 2004, and currently. So in the 90s, it took about an hour to download an MP3. So it was something you had to really want in order to be able to bother to download something like that. But in 2004, when we hit the half megabit per second, you could have decided you wanted to listen to a song, downloaded the song, and be listening to it within 10 minutes. Now, that was massive. That was really impressive for the time. And that led to kind of an explosion of people downloading music, listening to music illegally, effectively. What then happened was that the recording industry basically started suing lots of people. So they started suing people who had their IP address, so their home computer, associated with downloading music files. They would go off and and sue pretty much everybody or anybody they could find. So you'd get court cases where they would be talking about things like grandmothers had downloaded 10,000 songs. And it would turn out it was actually a grandchild somewhere, but they'd still take the grandmother to court rather than the actual person that was the problem. During the 2004 as well, something else became useful. Oops, I should. Something else became possible. So what I've got there is the amount of time it would take to download a DVD. So during the 90s, it was 12,500 minutes. That's about 208 hours or nearly 9 days. So if you're going to download a film during the 90s, it would be well over a week in order to do that. And in the UK, we actually paid for our internet calls. We actually paid to use a modem to connect to our internet per minute. So back in the 90s and early 2000s, it was just cheaper to go and buy the DVD or the VHS, depending on how far back into the 90s we were. But by 2004, by the time we had these broadband connections, we're now on just under 24 hours. So you could have a new movie downloaded to your computer within a day. What happened was that people would go out and record movies. They'd go out and record movies in cinemas using video cameras. So smartphones weren't a thing, not a reliable, good, high quality camera in a smartphone anyway. So people would take video cameras, they would sit in movie theaters, they would record the movie, and they would release it online so that people could download it and people could watch. And you'd get competitions between different groups of people who were trying to be the first to actually get a copy of a new release of a film out on the internet. And again, for context, I've put our 2020 numbers there, which is 24 minutes in order to download a film and be able to watch it. So less time than it takes to actually watch the film. There was also some other things going on that were quite useful as well. So what you should see there is a nice fuzzy picture. That is intentional. That isn't a dodgy network connection on my part. In 2004, there was a codec released, and the codec is the thing that compresses the video and makes it viewable, makes it either a lossless codec so you can compress and get as much information into it and have a high quality. So before 2004, we were typically stuck on lower quality codecs. And for the same amount of space, you would get something fuzzy and not that good to look at, not that useful to look at. But in 2004, DivX actually released a codec, which was a kind of MP4 version of a codec, which gave the ability to have smaller file sizes and higher quality. So what it meant was that you could actually store a Hollywood film on a single CD, with that single CD storing about 700 meg. So you could have a full film in about 700 meg, and it would look pretty good. What that also meant to is that there was lots of peer-to-peer file sharing programs popped up at around that time. So we ended up with things like LimeWire and BearShare and Napster, all of which turned up and all of which made it easier to be able to download files, download media, get hold of music, get hold of films and TV programs and software. So the piracy went from being a niche thing where you had to be quite tech savvy to be able to do it to be something that was easy for everybody to do. So as a summary for what was going on, in 2004, broadband gets good, or broadband gets fast enough that it actually is, you're able to do downloads of large files. Video compression gets good, so that you can make a nice quality video with a size that you can download within about a day. Writable CD-ROMs are pretty much common on computers. So you've pretty much got infinite storage because you can just store all your movies, all your downloaded TV programs on CDs, and it'd be absolutely fine. And there was a massive amount of peer-to-peer file sharing that just kind of exploded. The kinds of applications that were doing it increased and made it just a lot easier for people to be able to download stuff and grab hold of content. What that actually led to was the movie industry, which is the MPAA, the Motion Picture Association of America. They started behaving a bit like the music industry had. So what they were doing was suing people willy-nilly and trying to stop the spread of their media. But they were doing it in daft ways. So this article was actually something that inspired me to go and do something else that I'll talk about. But what they were doing is that they would look at, say, the file name of a file that was being stored online, and they would assume that if it matched a film name, then that was a copy of the film. So there were cases where the movie industry was suing Linux distributions, or they were suing open source software because they had a similar name to a Hollywood movie. There was a Frameworks, Grind and Twisted, or sorry, Grind and Twisted, which had similar names to some Hollywood movies, and the websites that were hosting those Python frameworks got cease and desist. Oh, I did forget about Kazaa. That's true. They got cease and desist letters saying, "Take down this bit of software because it is our movie." When that bit of software was kilobytes rather than the megabytes or the hundreds of megabytes that you would need in order to have a video online. So they were doing it kind of really, really terribly. At that time, so 2004, I was writing up a project for the final of my degree. So I was finishing off, and I'm sure as everybody knows, when you're trying to look at a big document and trying to write a big document, anything is more interesting than actually doing the work you're supposed to be doing. So I got really interested in this. So I started thinking about ways to identify video and how to do it in a fairly efficient way so that you didn't have to rely on things that were already embedded in it. So I can't use things like file names. That's been proven to be terrible. You can't use a file size because you can't really tell movies apart, or you can't tell big software distributions that are Linux CDs against a movie. You can't use the metadata. You can't use anything that's been embedded into that video file, because the first thing that people will do is strip it out again. So if you put the movie name in it, people are going to take it out, so you can't actually see it anymore. So I was thinking we have to do something that's going to be important for the video, something that's going to be preserved and something that will still be there all the time. So what I ended up thinking about was the motion that was in the video. So what we've got on screen there is a frame from a video, and where you can see the highlighted white, that is where there was motion on this video, and it picked it up and it's highlighted it, and it's making it to do a measure of that motion. Now, if you can use that motion and you can measure that motion, you can then turn that into a graph. So you can turn that into something that looks like a load of peaks and troughs. And if you can generate this data, you can use this data as a fingerprint, as a way of just identifying the video. So that's what I tried doing. I got things like this. I then tried it out, tried altering the video. It worked quite well. I then applied for some money to try and investigate this idea a bit further. So I ended up asking the Scottish government. I ended up asking the Scottish government for some money, and they gave me some money to actually investigate this and see if I could make it better and make it faster, make it more robust. I built myself a small Beowulf cluster. So that was, I think, 32 computers, all of which cost about 500 quid each. Ended up employing a couple of people. And what we ended up doing was just transcoding these videos, transcoding Hollywood movies, TV shows on these computers. We would change the bit rates that films were encoding at. We would change the frame rates, the frame sizes, so go from a big frame to a small frame. We would add borders. We would add colors in. We would just alter it as much as possible, mess with it as much as possible, and see if it was still identifiable. See if we could still identify the video after we had messed with it a lot. The other thing I also did was finish writing up and got my PhD at the same time. When we did that, we ended up getting these results. I'm sorry, these are terrible graphs. I couldn't find the originals, so I actually ripped these graphs out of a paper that I published on this topic. What it shows is the difference in the fingerprints over kind of up. I can do pointer up here. Yep. That's if you're changing the bit rate. So if you're making the quality of the video less and less. Once you go down to kind of this level, it's still identifiable, but it's unwatchable. You just wouldn't bother. The invention of the MPEG-4 made that people wouldn't bother doing that anymore. When you start messing with frame rates, once it gets down kind of lower than about 16 frames a second, it's not as identifiable anymore. But once you're getting down to that sort of level, it looks like a series of static images rather than looking like nice, smooth video. So people generally wouldn't watch it anyway. And at the bottom there, I've just shown what happens if you change the brightness, if you made it brighter or less bright. So we ended up, we ended up with a nice, robust way of identifying video. Now, that video identification method never actually ended up being used too much. But 2004 and the explosion of broadband, the explosion of piracy, effectively, did actually do some really good stuff. What it did end up doing is creating, or at least massively influencing, the movie industry to put its content online. So before the start of 2004, the movie industry was just thinking, what should happen is that people should go to the cinema, people should rent DVDs, people should have lockdown content. Whereas what actually happened was showing that people wanted to stream the content, people wanted convenience for the content. And over the subsequent 15 years or so, the industry picked that up and started doing things like Netflix and iPlayer and Hulu and Apple TV and kind of all the other systems where you can just stream video, audio, just conveniently and the way that you want to do it. Right. If there's any questions, feel free to ask. Alan, do you want to jump back in again?
Just switching the microphone on now.
Okay.
So, some people are saying some very nice things in the comments, and you took us back then down memory lane when you were talking about things like file sharing. I can remember, if there was a particular thing sometimes you wanted to download, you'd sort of have to leave the computer on overnight and then come down in the morning and hope it had downloaded that particular.
So there was so with like the movies, it would be people would just download overnight. So you could do 24 hours and get a film. It's people would do all sorts of things, especially with the, it used to be it'd take ages to get an album, free broadband, but it then just turned into people would download the entire TV series. So they would download 24 episodes of stuff, and it would take a week or two to do that. And that was back in the days when there was releases of TV programs a lot more common, but it released in the US first, and then the UK wouldn't get it for 6 months or a year. People just pirated it in the UK and would just watch it whenever it turned up.
I'm going to come on to a question from Gary in a moment. I do remember there was a particular media format, but I can't remember the name of it. But it used to manage to fit a movie onto a 600 megabyte disc.
Yep.
And whatever the codec was that was used, sometimes you'd notice it was sort of strong black backgrounds, a thing that you'd see these weird kind of tiles moving in the background that weren't there. It was sort of like
so that's just it's an encoding artifact.
That was it, yes.
Yeah. So that was MPEG-1, which wasn't a great codec, or I suppose it was a good codec, but it wasn't as I'll just answer Gary's question. I was living in Scotland.
Got 2 questions, yeah.
Yeah, I have seen the other one, but I was living in Scotland. I did my PhD there. So the way codecs work, the way they encode video, is that in order to get the lower size, they have to lose some data. And when you've got kind of a strong black, when you've got a strong set of colors, or maybe a gradient of color, they have to summarize that gradient. And you can see it more with dark colors than you can see with light colors. It's still there in the light colors. Like behind me, there will be gradations behind me that your eyes won't be able to pick up on, just because of the way your eyes work. It's nothing to do with the codec. If I just turn the lights off, you'd be able to see, well, the camera would struggle, but you'd also be able to see more of the gradation in the black colors there.
So I think we have time for one more question, and then I'm going to press pause or stop on the recording, and then after that we can have like an open mic. So the final question would be, it was Gary's one. Gary's keen to know, was the strategy system, the design you came up with, was it taken any further?
Right.
And I know the answer.
Yeah, you do, yeah. So, no is the answer. I got a number of patents out of it. So there's a number of patents, and we tried selling the technology in order to, well, we first started trying to sell the technology to lots of different places. We actually talked to the movie industry, MPAA. We entered a competition because mid-2000s, they were trying to work out, what do we do with all this piracy? Because they were still doing the daft ways of dealing with it. And we did really well in the competition. They just didn't take up any of the technologies that had actually been submitted. They ended up deciding that it wasn't worth it, and they were going to go a different way. They ended up with different methods of doing it. There are still companies that do piracy detection. So there are a number of companies that do scour peer-to-peer networks, that do scour all sorts of things and look to see what is being downloaded, what films are being done. But they're a lot less heavy-handed now, at least when they're contacting people and taking legal action, because they basically made it a PR disaster in the mid-2000s when they were doing it, when the movie industry and the music industry were doing it. So they actually care more about live events. They go more after people who are doing things like restreaming live streams of sports. So when you actually get a sports event streamed to you, some places will embed stuff into that sports event video stream, so that when you restream it, or if you restream it, they can detect whose stream it was that was being restreamed, so they know who to go after legally in order to take that down.
Right. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to press the stop on the recording, and